The house had grown quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not the calm quiet that once settled in after dinner, when the lights were low and the day felt complete. This was a careful quiet. The kind that made footsteps softer, doors slower, and movements measured. It was the kind of quiet that made a person aware of themselves in a place they once moved through without thought. Robert noticed it one evening while standing in the hallway, holding a cup of tea that had already begun to cool. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than it ever had before. Each second seemed heavier, as if time itself had learned to linger. This was the same house Robert had lived in for more than 30 years. He had chosen it, paid for it, and maintained it through every stage of his life. He remembered carrying his young son through this very hallway, remembered the laughter that once echoed freely through these rooms. Back then, the house had felt alive. Now, it felt watchful. The change hadn't come suddenly. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic moment that explained everything. It happened slowly, so slowly that Robert didn't realize what he was losing while it was happening. That was the most unsettling part. Years earlier, Robert had believed his life was settled in the best possible way. He had worked hard, stayed responsible, and raised his son with care. He believed that doing things the right way meant old age would come with dignity and security. He believed that love, when given honestly, returned naturally. His son used to call often in those days. He would stop by without notice, sit at the kitchen table, talk about plans and worries and small victories. Robert listened with quiet pride. Being needed felt better than any reward he had earned in his working years. The house reflected that sense of belonging. Every room held memories shaped by time rather than perfection. The kitchen table still carried faint marks from years of shared meals. The spare room held reminders of a life that had moved forward but never truly left. That's why the first changes didn't alarm him. A chair moved to another room. A cupboard reorganized. A gentle suggestion that one space wasn't really necessary anymore. None of it felt cruel. It all sounded reasonable. Robert had always believed that keeping peace was part of being a good parent. Gradually, without anyone asking him to, he began spending more time in his bedroom. His personal items followed him there, one by one. It wasn't forced. It simply felt easier. Quieter. Less complicated. At night, Robert closed his door softly and lay listening to the house settle. The same walls stood around him. The same roof sheltered him. But the comfort he once felt had thinned into something else, something uncertain. He found himself hesitating before opening cupboards. Sitting where he wouldn't be in the way. Choosing silence over explanation. These were small things, almost invisible, but together they changed how the house felt. What frightened Robert most was not anger or rejection. It was how normal everything appeared. The house still stood. Life still went on. Yet somewhere along the way, his place within it had quietly shifted. This story begins here, not with betrayal or cruelty, but with trust given freely, and a silence that slowly grew louder than words. There was a time when Robert believed the house would always feel this way. Back then, mornings began without hesitation. He moved freely from room to room, opened windows wide, let fresh air drift through the curtains. The house responded to him, settling and creaking the way an old companion does when it recognizes familiar footsteps. Nothing felt restricted. Nothing felt borrowed. Robert's life had not been grand, but it had been steady. He had worked most of his years without complaint, saved where he could, and learned to live within his means. The house was the one thing he felt truly proud of. Not because it was large or impressive, but because it represented consistency. It was proof that he had done something lasting. His son grew up inside these walls. Robert remembered helping with homework at the kitchen table, teaching him how to hold a hammer in the garage, standing in the doorway late at night waiting for him to come home safely. Parenting had never felt like a burden. It felt like purpose. As the years passed and his son became an adult, the relationship changed in small, natural ways. Conversations grew more practical. Visits became less frequent, but warmer. When his son spoke about work or plans, Robert listened carefully, offering advice only when asked. He didn't want to interfere. He wanted to support. When his son began talking about the future more seriously, Robert felt a quiet sense of relief. There was comfort in knowing someone was thinking ahead. There was comfort in hearing phrases like long-term and security spoken with confidence. The idea of the house coming up in those conversations felt natural. At first, it was mentioned casually. Not as a demand, not as pressure. Just as part of planning. Robert didn't feel alarmed. He felt included. Trusted. Needed. He had always believed that protecting your family sometimes meant letting go. He had watched friends cling too tightly to control, only to create distance with their children. Robert didn't want that. He wanted closeness. He wanted peace. The thought of giving the house to his son felt like the final step in doing things right. A way to ensure stability. A way to simplify life as he grew older. He told himself that ownership was only a technical detail. What mattered was family. He imagined holidays continuing as they always had. Conversations around the same table. Familiar routines carried forward. In his mind, nothing truly changed except paperwork. There were moments of hesitation, quiet ones he didn't share with anyone. Brief thoughts that passed through his mind late at night, quickly dismissed. He had raised his son well. He trusted him completely. Doubt felt unnecessary, even unkind. The day the documents were signed felt ordinary. No ceremony. No tension. Just a few pages, a pen, and a sense of responsibility fulfilled. Robert walked out feeling lighter, as if he had secured his family's future with a single thoughtful act. For a while, everything seemed to confirm that belief. Life continued much as it always had. Meals were shared. Conversations flowed easily. The house still felt familiar. Robert reassured himself that nothing fundamental had changed. What he didn't notice, what no one ever notices at first, was how quickly assumptions can replace understanding. How easily roles can shift without discussion. How power, once moved, rarely stays still. Robert continued living as he always had, unaware that the balance he relied on no longer rested in the same place. The house still stood. The family still gathered. The surface of life remained calm. And yet, something invisible had begun to move beneath it all. At the time, Robert felt proud. Content. Certain he had done the right thing. He couldn't see then that certainty itself can be fragile. Especially when it rests on silence. There was a time when Robert believed the house would always feel clean, this way. Neatly stacked. Back then, the kind of documents began without hesitation but calm. He moved Robert freely remembered how the pages smelled faintly of ink and paper, let fresh how the edges were perfectly aligned. The house nothing about that day suggested settling loss. And creaking the way an old everything companion does when it recognizes familiar He sat at footsteps. The table where he had eaten thousands felt of restricted. Sunlight fell across the surface in the same Robert's way it life always had not been grand, catching the but grain it had been of the steady. His son worked most nearby, of his years without complaint, confident, saved where he could, in a tone and learned to live within his means. Words like the simple, house was the one thing he felt and secure were used more than once. Not because it was large or impressive, but because it represented consistency. The explanation made sense. It was proof that he had done something the house now would avoid trouble later. His son grew up inside it would these reduce walls. Stress. Robert remembered helping with homework at the kitchen table. Robert had teaching him how to hold a hammer in the garage. Over the years. Standing in the doorway late at night waiting for him to come home about safely. Avoiding complications when age had never felt like a burden. He told himself this was no different. As the years passed, there was no pressure placed on him. The relationship changed in not small, the kind that raises natural alarms. Ways. No conversations grew more practical. No demands. Visits just became less frequent. That this was the warmer. Responsible thing to do. When his son spoke about the kind of decision a caring Robert listened carefully. Robert noticed his own hesitation only briefly. He didn't want to interfere. A pause before he wanted to support. A quiet thought began talking about the future more seriously. How many years Robert were tied to those quiet sense of relief. He dismissed it quickly. There was comfort in knowing someone was thinking ahead. Distrustful. There was comfort in hearing phrases like was the foundation of family and security. The pen felt heavier than expected. When he signed his house coming up in those conversations felt familiar. The same signature was mentioned for decades. Not as a demand, not as pressure. No shift as part of planning. No sudden realization. Feel alarmed. The moment passed like any other small task completed. Needed. Afterward, His
He had
son
always
smiled.
believed that protecting your
There
family
was relief in
sometimes
that smile.
meant letting go.
Gratitude,
He had
too.
watched friends cling too
Robert
tightly
felt
to
it
control
warm his chest,
only to create
He
distance
told
with their
himself
children.
this was how love worked.
Robert didn't
quietly,
want that.
without
He
spectacle.
wanted closeness.
For days after,
He wanted peace.
life continued as normal.
The thought of giving the house
Robert
to
moved
his son
through the
felt
house
like
as
the
he
final
always
step
had.
in doing things right.
Made his tea, a way to
Watched
ensure
the news.
stability, a
Tended
way
to
to
small
simplify
chores.
life as he grew
If
older.
there was any change,
He told
it was
himself
too
that
subtle to
ownership
name.
was only a technical
He
detail.
told himself the house
What
was
mattered
still
was
his home.
family. And in
He
many
imagined
ways,
holidays
it was.
continuing as they
He
always
slept
had.
in the same bed,
Conversations
used the
around
same
the same
bathroom,
table.
sat
Familiar
in the same
routines
chair.
carried forward.
Ownership,
He
in his
believed,
mind, was
nothing
only a
truly
word.
changed except
What
paperwork.
mattered was respect.
There were
and
moments
respect
of
was built
hesitation,
over a lifetime.
quiet ones he didn't
But
share
small
with
things
anyone.
began to feel
Brief
different.
thoughts that passed through his mind
Conversations
late at
became
night,
slightly
quickly
more
dismissed.
Suggestions
raised
came
his
more
son
often.
well.
He
Not
trusted
demands,
him completely.
never that.
But
Doubt
suggestions
felt
wrapped in
unnecessary,
practicality,
even unkind.
Robert
The
found
day the
himself
documents
agreeing
were
without
signed
thinking.
felt ordinary.
It seemed easier.
No ceremony.
It kept things smooth.
No tension.
He reminded
Just a few
himself
pages,
that change
a
was
pen,
natural,
and a sense of
that
responsibility
families evolved.
fulfilled.
That
Robert
flexibility
walked out
was
feeling
part of
lighter,
growing older
as
with
if he had
grace.
secured his family's
At
future
night,
with a
he
single
lay awake
thoughtful
sometimes,
act. Replaying the
For a
day
while,
the papers were
everything
signed,
seemed to confirm
not
that
with
belief,
regret, but with a
life
strange
continued
sense
much
of
as it
distance.
always had. As if that
Meals were
version of
shared.
himself had made a choice that
Conversations
this
flowed
version was
easily.
still catching up
The
to.
house still felt
There was
familiar.
no clear line
Robert
between before
reassured
and after.
himself that nothing
That was the
fundamental
trouble.
had changed. Everything
What he
blurred
didn't
together.
notice,
What
one
no
small
one ever
adjustment
notices
at a
at
time,
first,
was
one
how quickly
quickly
agreements
assumptions
can
following
replace
another.
understanding.
Robert didn't
How
feel
easily
wrong.
roles can shift
He
without
didn't feel
discussion.
betrayed.
How
He
power,
felt uncertain,
once moved, rarely
and
stays
uncertainty
still.
has a way of settling
Robert
deep
continued
when it
living
goes
as he always
unspoken.
had,
The
unaware
house
that the
still
balance
stood
he
firm
relied
around
on
him.
no longer rested
The walls
in the same
hadn't
place.
moved.
The
The
house
roof
still
still
held.
stood.
But something
family still
essential
gathered.
had shifted.
The surface
Something
of
that
life
didn't make a
remained calm.
sound when it changed.
And yet,
something
Robert
invisible
had
had
believed
begun
that
to
signing
move
his
beneath it
name
all.
was an act of love.
At the time,
Only
Robert
later
felt
would he
proud.
understand how easily
Content.
love can be misunderstood
Certain
when it
he
is
had
written
done the
into
right
ink
thing.
and silence.
He couldn't see then that certainty itself can be fragile, especially when it rests on silence. There was
Nothing
a time
changed
when
all at
Robert
once.
believed the house would
That
always
was what
feel
made
this
it
way.
so difficult to
Back
notice,
then, mornings
and even
began
harder
without
to speak
hesitation.
about.
He
Life
moved
in the
freely
house
from room
continued
to
on the
room,
surface,
opened
just as it
windows
always
wide,
had.
let fresh
Meals
air
were
drift
still
through the
prepared.
curtains.
Lights
The
were
house
still
responded
turned off
to
at
him,
night.
settling and
The front
creaking
door
the way
still
an old
locked with the
companion
same
does when it
familiar sound.
recognizes familiar footsteps.
Anyone looking from the outside
Nothing
would have
felt
seen
restricted.
nothing unusual.
Nothing felt
But
borrowed.
inside, the rhythm
Robert's
had shifted.
life had not been grand.
Robert began
but
to
it had
sense
been
it in
steady.
small moments.
He had worked
The
most
kind
of his
most
years
people would
without
brush
complaint,
aside without a
saved where he
second thought,
could,
and learned to
a
live
conversation
within
that
his means.
paused when he entered
The
the
house
room.
was the one thing
A
he
decision
felt
already
truly
made
proud
before
of.
he was informed.
Not because it was
A
large
plan
or
discussed
impressive,
as if he would
but because
naturally
it
adjust,
represented
rather than
consistency.
be included.
It was proof
At
that
first,
he had done
he told
something
himself
lasting.
this was normal.
His son grew
His
up
son
inside
was
these
managing more
walls.
now.
Robert remembered helping
had
with homework
shifted,
at the kitchen
and
table,
with it, authority.
teaching him how to hold a
Robert
hammer
didn't
in the
want
garage,
to interfere.
standing in the doorway
He had
late
spent
at
his
night
life
waiting
earning
for him
trust.
to come home
He
safely.
didn't want to lose it by seeming
Parenting had
difficult.
never felt like a burden.
He noticed that certain
It felt
rooms
like
no
purpose.
longer felt like places
As
to
the years
relax.
passed and his son
The
became
living
an
room
adult,
became busier,
the relationship
louder,
changed
filled
in
with
small,
activity that
natural
didn't include
ways.
him.
Conversations
He found himself
grew
choosing
more
quieter
practical.
corners of the house
Visits
without
became
being
less
asked to.
frequent, but
It
warmer.
felt considerate.
When his son spoke
Respectful.
about work or plans,
Gradually,
Robert listened
suggestions
carefully,
turned into
offering
expectations.
advice only when asked.
The television
He
volume
didn't want
was
to
adjusted.
interfere.
Lights
He wanted
were
to
turned off
support.
sooner.
When his
Meals
son
were
began
eaten at
talking
different
about the
times.
future more seriously,
None of it came with
Robert felt a
explanation
quiet
or
sense of
conflict.
relief.
It simply
There was
happened.
comfort in knowing someone was
Robert
thinking
adapted,
ahead,
as he always
There was
had.
comfort in hearing
He
phrases
believed
like
this was what compromise
long-term
looked like.
and security.
He had lived long
Spoken
enough
with
to know that
confidence.
harmony often
The
requires
idea of the
silence.
house coming up in those
His belongings
conversations
began
felt
to feel
natural.
out of place.
At first,
A book
it
left
was
on the
mentioned
table was
casually,
moved.
not as a
Shoes
demand,
placed
not
near
as
the door
pressure.
were shifted aside.
Just as part of planning.
These were small things.
Robert didn't
easily
feel
ignored,
alarmed, but together
He
they
felt
carried
included.
a message Robert struggled to
Trusted.
name.
Needed.
This is not your space
He had
anymore.
always believed that
He
protecting
didn't
your
say
family
that out loud.
sometimes meant letting go.
He didn't even
say
He
it
had
to
watched
himself.
friends cling too tightly
He simply
to control,
adjusted,
only to
chose
create
not to
distance
leave
with their
things out.
children. Chose
Robert
not to
didn't
ask
want that.
questions that might
He
create
wanted
discomfort.
closeness.
Chose
wanted
calm
peace.
over clarity.
The thought of
At
giving
night,
the house
he spent
to his
more
son
time
felt
in his
like the
room.
final step in doing
Not because
things right.
anyone told him to,
A way to
but
ensure
because it
stability.
felt like the only place
A way
where
to
nothing
simplify
needed to
life
be
as he grew
negotiated.
older.
His room
He told
became
himself that
predictable,
ownership was only a
safe,
technical detail.
contained.
What mattered was
The
family.
door, once always
He
open,
imagined
now
holidays
stayed
continuing
closed
as
more
they
often.
always had.
Robert told himself
Conversations
this
around
was
the
part
same
of
table.
aging.
Familiar
That stepping
routines
back was
carried
natural.
forward. In
that
his
giving
mind,
space to younger
nothing
lives
truly
was
changed
generous.
except paperwork.
He believed that
There
love
were moments of
sometimes meant
hesitation,
becoming smaller.
quiet ones he didn't
Still,
share with anyone.
there were moments that lingered
Brief
longer
thoughts
than
that
they should
passed
have.
through his mind late at
A
night,
casual comment
quickly
about
dismissed.
how things are
He
done
had raised
now.
his son well.
A reminder about
He trusted
costs
him
and
completely.
efficiency.
Doubt
A tone
felt
that
unnecessary,
suggested authority
even
rather
unkind.
than conversation.
The day the documents
Each moment
were signed
passed
felt
quickly,
ordinary,
but it left something
no
behind.
ceremony.
Robert
No
found
tension.
himself thinking carefully
Just a few
before
pages,
speaking,
a pen,
measuring
and a sense
his
of
words,
responsibility fulfilled.
deciding whether something
Robert
was worth
walked out
mentioning.
feeling lighter.
Silence
as if he had
became
secured his
easier than
family's future
explanation.
with a single thoughtful
And over
act.
time,
For
silence
a while,
became habit.
everything seemed to confirm
What unsettled
that
him
belief.
most was how
Life
reasonable
continued
everything
much as it
sounded.
always had.
No one was
Meals
unkind.
were shared.
No one raised their
Conversations
voice.
flowed easily.
There were no
The
harsh
house still
words to
felt
point
familiar.
to. No obvious
Robert
injustice
reassured
to
himself
defend
that
against.
nothing fundamental
That
had
made his
changed.
discomfort feel
What he
unjustified.
didn't notice, what
He
no
told
one ever
himself he
notices
was
at
imagining
first,
things,
was how quickly
that
assumptions
gratitude
could
should
replace
outweigh
understanding.
unease. How
That peace
easily
was
roles
more
can
important
shift
than
without
position.
discussion. After
How
all,
power
he had
once
chosen
moved,
this.
rarely stays
He had
still.
trusted. Robert
didn't want
continued
to
living
question
as he
his
always
own
had,
decision,
unaware that
but
the
something
balance he
fundamental
relied on
had
no longer
changed.
rested in the same
The
place.
house no longer responded
house
to him
still
the
stood.
way it once had.
The family still
It no
gathered.
longer felt like an
The
extension
surface
of
of
his
life
life.
remained calm.
It felt
And
managed,
yet, something invisible had
organized,
begun to move beneath
controlled
it all.
in ways he didn't
At the
fully
time,
understand.
Robert felt proud.
Robert still lived there,
content. He still
certain
slept
he
under
had
the
done the
same
right
roof.
thing.
But
He
his
couldn't
presence
see then
felt
that certainty
conditional
itself
now,
can be
shaped
fragile,
by rules that were never
especially
spoken
when it
aloud.
rests on silence.
And the hardest part was this: no one ever told him he had less say. He simply felt it. There was a time when Robert believed the house would always feel this way. Back
It had
then,
been a spare
mornings
space,
began without hesitation.
a place for extra
He
blankets,
moved freely from
old
room
boxes,
to room, things
opened
that didn't
windows
need daily
wide,
attention.
let fresh air
Now,
drift through the curtains.
without any clear decision
The house
being
responded
made,
to him.
it became his
Settling
center.
and creaking the way
The
an
place
old
where his
companion
day
does
both
when it
began and
recognizes
ended.
familiar footsteps.
He didn't move into it all at
Nothing
once.
felt restricted.
At first,
Nothing
it was
felt
just
borrowed.
convenience.
Robert's
His
life
clothes
had not
were
been
already
grand,
there,
but it had been
his
steady.
reading glasses.
He had worked
The
most
chair
of his
by the
years
window
without
where the light
complaint,
was good in the
saved where he
afternoon.
could, and learned
Slowly,
to live within
the rest
his
of the
means.
house started to feel
The
busy,
house was
occupied,
the one thing he felt
filled with
truly
movement
proud
that
of.
didn't require his
Not because
presence.
it was large or
So
impressive,
Robert stayed
but
where
because
it was
it
quiet.
represented consistency.
His belongings followed
It
him
was
naturally.
proof that he had done something
few books.
lasting.
His
Family
son grew up
photographs,
inside these walls.
medication neatly
Robert
arranged
remembered
on a
helping
small
with
table.
homework at the kitchen table.
Each item brought in
teaching
without
him
discussion,
how to hold a hammer
without
in the
resistance.
garage, standing in the
It
doorway
felt temporary
late at night
at
waiting
first.
for him to come home
A
safely.
phase.
Something
Parenting
that
had
would never
correct
felt
itself.
like a burden.
But temporary
It felt
habits
like
have a
purpose.
way of settling into
As the years
permanence.
passed and his son
Robert
became an
noticed
adult,
that he no
the
longer left
relationship
his things
changed
outside
in
the
small,
room.
natural
It
ways.
wasn't because anyone complained.
Conversations grew more
It
practical.
was because it felt safer not
Visits
to.
became less frequent,
Safer to
but
keep his
warmer.
life contained.
When his son spoke
Predictable.
about work or plans,
Easy to
Robert
manage.
listened carefully.
The room was
offering
small,
advice only
but it
when
was
asked.
his.
He didn't
kept
want to
it tidy.
interfere. Almost
wanted
too
to
tidy.
support.
The
When
bed
his
was
son
made
began
early
talking
each
about
morning,
the future more
the
seriously,
door closed gently.
Robert felt a quiet
He learned
sense
which
of relief.
floorboard creaked and
There was
stepped
comfort
around
in
it.
knowing someone was
These
thinking
small
ahead.
precautions became
There
routine.
was comfort in hearing
practiced
phrases
without
like
thought.
long
He
term
told himself he
and
was being
security,
respectful,
spoken with confidence.
Meals were quieter now.
The idea of the house
Sometimes
coming
shared,
up in those
sometimes
conversations
not.
felt natural.
Robert adjusted
At
without
first,
comment.
it was mentioned
He
casually.
didn't want to interrupt.
Not as a demand,
Didn't
not
want
as
to ask
pressure.
why schedules had
Just
changed.
as part of planning.
He reminded himself
Robert
that
didn't feel
families
alarmed.
evolve, that routines
felt
shift as
included,
lives become more complex.
trusted,
Needed.
Still, there were
He
moments
had always
that caught
believed
him
that
off guard.
protecting your family sometimes
Standing in the
meant
hallway,
letting go,
unsure where to sit.
He had watched friends cling
reaching
too
for
tightly
something
to
and
control,
stopping halfway,
only to create
lowering
distance
his
with their
voice
children.
without knowing why.
Robert didn't
None
want
of
that.
these moments felt
He
dramatic.
wanted closeness.
They felt normal.
He wanted peace.
That was what made
The
them
thought
heavy.
of giving the house to his
At
son
night,
felt like
Robert
the final
lay awake
step in
listening
doing
to
things
sounds
right.
from the rest of the house.
A way to ensure stability.
Laughter.
A way to
Television.
simplify life
Doors
as he grew
opening
older.
and closing.
He told himself that
continuing,
ownership was
just
only a
slightly out of
technical
reach.
detail. He
What
didn't
mattered
feel
was
excluded.
family.
He
felt
imagined
peripheral.
holidays continuing.
He began
as they
locking
always
his
had.
door before sleeping.
Conversations around
Not
the
out of
same
fear.
table. At
Familiar
least,
routines
that's what he
carried
told
forward.
himself. In
It
his
was for
mind,
privacy,
nothing truly changed
comfort,
except paperwork.
for habit.
There were moments of
But the
hesitation.
click of the lock
quiet
echoed
ones
longer
he
than it
didn't
should
share
have.
with anyone. In the mornings,
thoughts
he woke
that
early,
passed through his mind late
earlier
at night,
than necessary.
quickly dismissed.
He preferred moving
He had
through the
raised
house
his
when
son
it was
well.
empty.
He trusted
When he
him
didn't need to
completely.
think about where he
Doubt
belonged,
felt unnecessary.
he avoided
even
asking
unkind.
for things.
The day the
Avoided
documents were
making
signed
requests.
felt ordinary.
Independence,
No
he
ceremony.
believed,
was the
no
last
tension.
dignity he could protect.
Just a few pages,
he had spent a lifetime
and a sense of
providing.
responsibility
Depending
fulfilled.
now felt unnatural.
Robert walked out feeling
the house
lighter,
still held
as
his
if
memories,
he had secured his
but they
family's
felt
future
distant,
with a single thoughtful
as if
act.
they belonged to another
For
version
a while,
of him.
everything
The
seemed
man
to
who
confirm
once
that
moved
belief.
freely,
Who spoke without
continued
measuring
much as
his
it
words,
always had,
who didn't need
meals
to
were
justify
shared,
his presence.
conversations
That man
flowed
felt
easily.
far away.
The house
Robert
still felt
told
familiar.
himself he should be grateful.
Robert reassured
He
himself
had a roof.
that nothing fundamental
He had
had
family.
changed. Many
What
people
he didn't
had
notice,
less. What no
these
one
thoughts
ever
kept him
notices
quiet,
at first, was
kept
how
him
quickly
compliant,
assumptions can replace
kept him from
understanding.
naming what he was slowly
how easily
losing.
roles can shift
What he
without
didn't yet
discussion.
understand was that
How
space
power
shapes identity.
once moved, rarely
and as
stays
his space
still.
shrank, so did
Robert
his sense
continued
of self.
living as he always
The room
had,
at the end
unaware
of the hallway
that the
became
balance
more
he
than a
relied
place
on
no
to
longer
sleep.
rested in the same
It
place.
became a boundary. The house still
a limit.
stood. The
A
family
reminder
still
that something
gathered.
once shared had
The surface
quietly
of
become
life
something
remained
else.
calm. And
Robert
yet,
lived there
something
now.
invisible had begun
Not because
to
he
move
was
beneath
told
it
to,
all, but
At the
because there
time,
was nowhere
Robert
else
felt
that
proud,
felt entirely his.
content,
Certain he had done the right thing. He couldn't see then that certainty itself can be fragile, especially when it rests on silence. There was
came
a
a
time
night
when
when
Robert
Robert
no
believed the
longer
house
felt
would
neutral.
always feel this way.
It was late.
Back then,
The
mornings
kind of late
began
when
without
sounds travel
hesitation.
farther than they should.
He moved freely
Robert
from room
was
to
awake
room,
in his room,
opened windows
sitting
wide,
on the edge of the
let
bed,
fresh air
listening.
drift through the curtains.
He hadn't intended
The
to
house
stay
responded to him.
Sleep
Settling
simply
and
didn't
creaking
arrive
the
the
way
way
an
an
old
old
companion does when it
From down the
recognizes
hallway came
familiar
voices.
footsteps.
Low at
Nothing
first.
felt restricted.
Then sharper.
Nothing felt borrowed.
Not shouting. Never
Robert's
shouting.
life had not been
but
grand,
firm enough to carry.
but it had been steady.
His name
He had
surfaced
worked
briefly,
most of his years
spoken
without
complaint,
ceremony,
saved
as
where
if
he
it
could,
were a practical
and learned
detail
to live
in
with
within his
conversation
means.
that didn't require
The
his
house was the
presence.
one thing he felt
Robert
truly
sat
proud
still.
of.
He
Not
told
because it
himself
was
not to
large
listen,
or impressive,
that
but because it
overhearing was
represented
rude.
consistency.
That adults spoke
It was
freely in
proof
their own
that he had
homes.
done something lasting.
Still, his body
His son
remained
grew up
tense,
inside these
as
walls.
if it understood something his
Robert
mind
remembered
hadn't
helping
yet
with
accepted.
homework at the kitchen table,
A door closed,
teaching him how to hold
another
a hammer
opened.
in the garage,
Footsteps
standing in the
crossed
doorway
the
late
living
at
room.
night waiting for him
Then
to come
came
home
the sound
safely.
that changed the air in
Parenting
the house.
had never felt like a
lot.
burden.
It
It
wasn't
felt
his
like
door.
purpose. It was
As the
one
years
he had
passed
never
and
heard.
his
His
son
son
before.
became an adult.
The sound was
relationship
soft,
changed in
almost
small,
polite, natural
but it
ways.
echoed in his chest.
Conversations
Robert
grew more
waited
practical.
for the familiar feeling of
Visits
reassurance
became
to
less
follow,
frequent,
the sense
but
that
warmer.
everything was fine.
When his son spoke
It
about
didn't
work
come.
or plans,
He lay
Robert
back on
listened
the bed,
carefully,
staring at
offering
the ceiling,
advice only
tracing
when
the
asked.
faint crack above
He
the
didn't
light
want
fixture.
to interfere.
He remembered
wanted to
repairing
support.
it years ago,
When his
standing
son
on a
began
chair,
talking
steadying
about the
himself
future
with
more
one
seriously.
hand. Robert
Back
felt
then,
a quiet
the house
sense of
had
relief.
responded to him.
There was comfort
It had
in
needed
knowing
him.
someone was thinking ahead.
Now,
It felt
there was
sealed
comfort
off,
in hearing phrases
sectioned,
long-term,
organized,
and security.
Robert realized
spoken
he no
with
longer
confidence.
knew which doors were
The
open
idea
to him.
of the house coming up
in the early
those
hours of the
conversations
morning
felt
he
natural.
needed water.
At first,
His throat
it
felt
was mentioned
dry,
casually.
He stood
Not as a
quietly,
demand, not
opened
as
his
pressure,
door, and stepped
just
into the
as
hallway.
part of planning.
The house
Robert
felt
didn't
unfamiliar
feel
at
alarmed.
night, shadows
He felt
heavier
included.
than usual.
Trusted.
He hesitated near the
Needed.
kitchen.
The
He
light
had
was
always
off.
believed that protecting
The
your
door
family
partially
sometimes
closed.
meant letting go.
He stood there
He had
longer than
watched friends
necessary,
cling too tightly
debating
to
whether
control,
to enter,
only to
The
create
thought
distance
surprised
with their
him.
children.
This was
Robert
his kitchen.
didn't want that.
Or at least
He wanted
it had
closeness.
He stepped
He
back
wanted
instead
peace.
and returned to his room.
The thought of giving
Closing
the house
door
to his son
softly
felt
behind
like the
him.
final step in
That
doing
was the
things
moment
right.
something broke.
A way to
Not
ensure
loudly.
stability.
Not
A way
visibly.
to simplify life.
Just
as
a
he grew
small
older.
fracture inside him.
He
that
told
refused
himself
to
that
heal.
ownership was
The
only
next
a
day
technical
passed
detail.
without comment. What mattered
Breakfast
was family.
was routine.
He imagined
Conversations
holidays continuing
normal.
as they always
No
had.
one mentioned the night.
Conversations around
Robert
the same
didn't
table.
either.
He
Familiar
told himself
routines
it meant
carried
nothing.
forward.
That
In
he
his
was
mind,
reading too much
nothing
into
truly
it.
changed
That
except
silence
paperwork.
was easier than
There were moments of
confrontation.
hesitation, but something
Quiet
had
ones
shifted
he didn't
permanently.
share with anyone.
He began to
Brief
feel
thoughts
watched,
that passed through
not
his
in a
mind late at
threatening way,
night, but in a
quickly
measured
dismissed.
one. As
He
if
had
his
raised
presence
his son
needed
well.
to be accounted for.
He trusted him completely.
His movements calculated.
Doubt felt unnecessary,
His habits
even
adjusted.
unkind.
Robert
The day
stopped
the
leaving
documents
his room
were signed
unless
felt
necessary.
ordinary.
He ate
No
quietly.
ceremony.
He
No
spoke
tension.
less.
Just
Each
a few
decision
pages,
was made
a
with
pen,
care,
and a sense
weighed
of
against the risk of
responsibility
discomfort.
fulfilled.
He wasn't angry.
Walked out feeling lighter.
He was tired,
as if he had secured his family's future with a single thoughtful act.
Tired
For
of convincing himself
everything
that
seemed to confirm
that belief.
That night, he
Life
sat on his bed holding a
always
photograph he kept in the drawer.
Meals were shared.
It showed his son as a
Conversations
child,
flowed
standing
easily.
in the garden,
The house
smiling
still
without
felt familiar.
restraint. Robert reassured
the edge
himself
of the
that
picture
nothing
with his
fundamental
thumb.
had changed. He had given everything
What he didn't
knew
notice,
how to give. What no one
he
ever
had
notices
trusted
without
first,
condition was how quickly
and now,
assumptions
the
could
house
replace
that once echoed
understanding.
with certainty felt
How
like a
easily
place where
roles
every
can
shift
shift without
required
discussion.
permission. Robert
power,
didn't cry.
Once moved,
he didn't
rarely
raise
stays
his
still.
voice.
Robert
He didn't
continued
make
living
demands.
as he always had.
He simply sat
unaware
there,
that the balance he
understanding
relied on
something
no
he
longer
hadn't allowed
rested in the
himself
same
to
place.
see before.
The house
This
still
wasn't
stood.
about misunderstanding.
The family still gathered.
It was about power.
The surface of life
and power
remained calm.
once shifted,
and yet
rarely moves
something
back
invisible
on its own.
had begun to move
The
beneath
lock
it
had
all.
made that clear.
At the time, Robert felt proud, content, certain he had done the right thing. He couldn't see then that certainty itself can be fragile, especially when it rests on silence. There was a time when Robert believed the house would always feel
Lights
this way.
slipped through the thin gap in the
then,
curtains.
Mornings began without
The house
hesitation.
settled into its usual sounds.
He moved freely
distant
from room
footsteps,
to room,
opened
the faint
windows
clink
wide,
of a cup, let
a door
fresh air
opening and
drift
closing
through the
somewhere
curtains.
far away.
The house responded
From the
to
outside,
him,
nothing
settling
had
and
changed.
creaking the way an old
The house
companion
still stood
does
firm,
when it recognizes
unchanged,
familiar
ordinary.
footsteps. Inside,
Nothing felt
Robert moved
restricted.
slowly. Nothing
He
felt
sat on the
borrowed.
edge of the bed for a
Robert's
moment longer
life
than
had not
usual,
been grand,
letting
but
the
it
day
had been
begin
steady.
without him.
He had worked
His room
most of
was
his
neat,
years
controlled,
without
careful,
complaint,
saved
everything
where he
in its
could,
place,
and learned to live within
he folded
his
the
means.
blanket, adjusted
The house
pillow,
was the one
and
thing
stood
he felt
quietly,
truly proud of.
This small space
Not
had
because
become
it was
his
large
world,
or impressive,
not by decision,
but because it
by
represented
acceptance.
Consistency.
Over time,
It was proof
Robert
that
had
he had
learned
done
how to
something
exist
lasting.
without drawing attention.
His son grew up
He
inside
chose
these
the right
walls.
moments to step out.
Robert remembered
He
helping
learned
with
when
homework
silence
at the
was
kitchen
safer than
table,
speech,
teaching him how
These
to hold a
lessons
hammer
were never
in the
spoken
garage.
aloud.
Standing in the doorway,
They were learned
late
through
at night,
observation
waiting for him to
through
come home
tones
safely.
through absence. Parenting had
He
never
once
felt
believed
like
this
a
was
burden.
maturity.
It felt
That
like letting
purpose.
go showed wisdom.
As the years
That
passed
shrinking
and his
made
son
room
became
for
an
peace.
adult,
The relationship
peace should
changed
never
in
feel
small,
like erasure.
natural ways.
As he passed through the
Conversations
hallway, Robert
grew more
glanced
practical.
at the walls that once held
Visits
memories,
became
now
less frequent,
softened by
but
fresh
warmer.
paint.
When
The
his
marks
son
of
spoke
time had
about
been
work or
covered.
plans,
The
Robert
past
listened
neatly
carefully,
replaced by
offering
something new
advice
cleaner,
only when asked.
quieter.
He didn't
Nothing
want
had
to
been
interfere.
taken from him suddenly.
He wanted to support.
That was the hardest
When
part
his
to
son
accept.
began talking about the
There were
future
no
more
threats.
seriously, no
Robert
raised
felt
voices,
a quiet sense of relief.
no moment he
There
could
was
point
comfort
to
in
and knowing
knowing
someone
someone
was
was
thinking
against.
ahead. Everything
There was
had
comfort
happened
in
gently,
hearing phrases
wrapped
like
in reason and
long-term
practicality, and
security,
and because of that,
spoken
his
with
loss
confidence.
had gone unnoticed.
The idea
Even
of the
by
house
himself
coming
for
up
a
in
long
those
time,
conversations felt
Robert
natural.
did not hate his son.
At first, it
That
was mentioned
surprised him
casually.
most of all. Not as
What
a
he
demand,
felt was
not as
deeper than
pressure.
anger.
Just
It
as
was
part
grief.
of planning.
Grief
Robert
for the
didn't
role he
feel
once
alone.
held.
For
He
the
felt
confidence
included.
he once carried.
Trusted.
For the belief
Needed.
that love alone
He
could
had
protect
always
a
believed
person's
that protecting
place in
your
the world.
family sometimes meant
He had
letting
trusted
go.
fully. He had watched
He had
friends
given
cling
freely.
too tightly to control,
And in doing so,
only to create
he had learned
distance
something
with their
painful
children.
but true.
Robert didn't
Love
want
should
that.
never require silence.
He wanted closeness.
Trust should never
He wanted
cost
peace.
dignity.
In the
thought
quiet
of
of
giving
his
the
room
house
each
to his
night,
son felt
Robert
like the final
began
step
to
in doing
understand that
things
while
right.
he could not change
A
what
way
had
to
already
ensure
happened,
stability.
he could change
A way
how
to
he
simplify
carried it.
life as he grew
Naming
older.
the truth gave him
He
something
told himself
back.
that ownership
Clarity.
was only a technical
Awareness.
detail.
A
What
sense
mattered
of self
was
that had
family.
been slipping away.
He imagined
unnoticed.
holidays continuing.
This story
as
is
they
not
always
told
had.
to create fear.
Conversations
It is
around
told
the same
so that
table.
quiet lessons are
Familiar
heard before
routines
they become
carried
quiet
forward.
regrets.
In his mind,
Because what
nothing
happened to
truly
Robert
changed
does not
except
begin with
paperwork.
cruelty.
There were
It
moments
begins
of
with
hesitation,
love, generosity,
quiet ones he
and
didn't
the
share
belief
with
that
anyone.
family will always
Brief
protect you.
thoughts that passed through
And
his mind late
sometimes
at
that
night
belief
quickly
deserves
dismissed.
careful thought. He had
If
raised
this story
his son
stayed
well.
with you,
Take a
he
moment
trusted
to
him
subscribe.
completely.
These
Doubt
stories
felt
exist
unnecessary,
so that no one
even
feels
unkind.
alone in experiences
The day
that
the
are rarely
documents
spoken
were
about.
signed felt
and so
ordinary.
that trust can be given
No
wisely,
ceremony,
not blindly.
no tension.
Thank you for
Just
listening.
a few pages,
a pen, and a sense of responsibility fulfilled.
Robert walked out feeling lighter, as if he had secured his family's future with a single thoughtful act. For a while, everything seemed to confirm that belief. Life continued much as it always had. Meals were shared. Conversations flowed easily. The house still felt familiar. Robert reassured himself that nothing fundamental had changed. What he didn't notice, what no one ever notices at first, was how quickly assumptions can replace understanding. How easily roles can shift without discussion. How power, once moved, rarely stays still. Robert continued living as he always had, unaware that the balance he relied on no longer rested in the same place. The house still stood. The family still gathered. The surface of life remained calm. And yet, something invisible had begun to move beneath it all. At the time, Robert felt proud. Content. Certain he had done the right thing. He couldn't see then that certainty itself can be fragile. Especially when it rests on silence.